Well, welcome to our series playlist. If you have missed out on the first few weeks of this, here's what we're doing. If this is your first go at church, and you're like, all right, what are we talking about? What are we doing? We've been talking about music, specifically the lyrics. And we talk about how music shapes us. You listen to stuff, I listen to stuff. We all have opinions and thoughts and stuff that we love, stuff that creates our moods, music that we just literally makes the whole day good. And some, if you're having a bad day, you listen to that music. The lyrics in the music, they shape us. In fact, they define, I think, culture, or they at least articulate what's going on in culture. And we nerded it out, okay? And I'll just admit that we nerded it out, that there are themes in all of lyrics. 7 specifically. Seven themes that if you're going to write a song and that you're gonna go after this certain subject. So if you missed out, go catch some of the topics we've talked about. I think it's been really, really good. But this week, we let Queen help us understand one of the major themes in lyrics, but in life. Let me take you to these lyrics, because I think they help us. Just give me what I know is mine. People, do you hear me? Just give me the sign. It ain't much I'm asking if you want the truth. Here's the future for the dreams of youth. I want it all, I want it all, I want it all, and I want it now. I mean, I think this might be one of the most blatant themes that these lyrics spell out, but I mean, here's what it is. It's greed. If you look at music, you're going to find one of the major themes is greed. But I would tell you this, and follow me, I would tell you, I think one of the major themes in life is greed. I would tell you that if you and I were to be super open about a daily struggle, or at least a regular struggle, is that you and I both, we struggle with greed, fighting it, keeping it at bay, because there are things that you and I want, and we want it right now, and we wrestle with greed. Now, most of us would not raise our hand and say, hey, guess what? I'm a greedy person. We just don't do that. But we all should be honest about it, that it's a temptation. Maybe different forms of greed. But even though you and I can identify with perhaps being tempted by greed, you need to know that this conversation is not just a stereotypical conversation. In fact, the subject of greed has extreme weight to it. Greed, the conversation is not just about what do we give to people and how do we spend our money and what do we crave. I would tell you greed is one of the major things that God helps you and I understand how to fight. But here's the weight of the conversation. It's in the Bible. You can be sure that no immoral, impure, or greedy person will inherit the kingdom of Christ and of God. I mean, if you're new to the Bible and you're like inherit what kingdom? This is saying that no immoral, impure, or greedy person will spend eternity with God in heaven. For a greedy person is an idolater, meaning worshiping the things of this world. I mean, I'm not trying to be over dramatic here, but if you're unwilling to discuss the potential of greed in your life, in my life, in our life, you need to know that there are consequences that I think you and I don't want to face. And if you and I don't want to face those consequences, we've got to deal with the subject of greed. In fact, I would tell you specifically about Jesus. One of the major themes of Jesus' teaching while on earth was about possessions and money. If you don't know this, if you look all of the different lessons he taught, the majority of them, if you percentage them, they would be about possessions, money, what you and I do with our resources. Over a third of them. If you were to look at the Bible as a whole, you need to know that money and possessions is talked more about in the Bible than topics like prayer and faith. And Jesus felt so passionate about this that he mentioned it. Let me just show you, here's just one of the places. Watch out. And these are the words of Jesus. Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. I find it that we get so offended by conversations about greed that we miss some of the powerful words of Jesus himself. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Now, I know most of us would be like, I know that. Most of us, especially, we would say, I know that true happiness doesn't come in this abundance of possessions. But I would say we know it, but we don't always apply it. And you have lyric after lyric, song after song that begins to describe at least a temptation that you and I have, almost an attitude that we begin to live life thinking, I need more, I want more. There's just this craving. And I'm not saying money's bad. Money's not bad. Resources aren't bad. Jesus never spoke and said, hey, you may never have anything. You must always live destitute. The evil is not money, but our attitude. Our attitude toward money can become a problem. Our attitude toward money, the weight that we give, the power that we let it have in our lives, our attitude toward money can become a problem. Let's talk about that. See, sometimes our attitude toward money is, well, I don't care. That's what some of us right now are even thinking. Like, David, I do not have a greed problem because I don't really care about money. I don't care about those things. I'm just pretty much indifferent about it. But here's your problem. If you don't care about money, if you don't care how much you have or don't have or what you give or don't give, if you're indifferent about it, then you are not modeling Jesus' posture towards it. Jesus was not indifferent about money. We have story after story where there's times that Jesus got angry about what people were doing with money. Jesus challenged people about what they do with their money. So if you're indifferent about it, that's a problem because Jesus himself was not indifferent about it. God is not indifferent about it. You shouldn't be indifferent about it. But maybe you're a little bit different. Like, here's my attitude towards money. I don't have enough. Is that not what a lot of us process? You're like, here's my problem with money. I need more of it. And you're like, yeah, some of you're even amening. You're like, yes, give me some more money. Where do I get more money? And some of us live in this posture, this attitude that we can't do what we should do, want to do, ought to do because we don't have enough. Meanwhile, God said, I will take care of every one of your needs. God does not want you not having the clothes that you need, the shelter that you need. God doesn't want you living in this destitute life where you are going to literally die because you don't have what you need. Come on. Some of us wonder if God cares about us because we don't have what we want. And he's like, no, I'll address what you need. Those are different attitudes, but I don't think those are the most toxic attitudes when it comes to money and resources. You can be indifferent. That's not good. You can wallow in not having enough. But let me show you the most dangerous attitude toward money. It's that. What I have is mine. I would tell you that if you and I don't wrestle this, if you and I don't deal with this, then we're going to find ourselves having greed take over. Let me take you back to the lyrics of the song that you've heard and wrestled. If you missed it, just give me what I know is mine. If you're honest, you have to admit that you and I wrestle with this. We look at the money that we have or don't have, and we begin to think about what is mine, what should be mine, what I want to be mine. You and I have wrestled with this for a long time, but I'm just telling you this mine battle with resources will lead you to a place that greed consumes you. You may not raise your hand and say you're greedy, but I would tell you, if you're living this life right now, believing that everything you have or want, it's mine, then you're not going to have a full, satisfying life. And greed's going to be knocking at your door all the time. God answered what is mine and what is his. Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's, okay? I don't know how to spell it out more clearly. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Everything. The world and all its people belong to him. If you want to know who wins the conversation, who owns everything, who owns what we have, what you have, what all that, God does. It's his. It's not mine. It's not yours. But if you live life believing that what you have is yours, greed. I have tried, as a parent, I have tried to help my children from very young ages, because I see adults who once you get locked into normal living, you're like, I don't know how to break out of this because there's things I want. I now have a job. I can pay for some of it, or I can get a loan for some of it. And we begin to think, okay, I'm going to have this. I think the most critical time to actually defeat greed for the rest of your life is when you're young, when you learn those core principles. So as a dad, I've been trying to teach my kids how to fight greed. And multiple times I've told you a story, but many of you are brand new, and I think it catches us all, and we begin to see ourselves for what we really wrestle with. I want to walk you into a lesson that I've shared with each of my kids. It's usually at the movie theater. See, typically when we go on vacation, one of the things that we love to do is we all go to the movie theater. Typically in the summer, there's a new release for the kids, and when we go, it's a whole experience. I don't know how you feel about the movies or what you do. Some of you sneak your own snacks in and all that, and you know who you are. But one of the experiences is we go in, and I let each of our kids, they go to the glorious candy case, and they get to pick one of them, and they can have that. So each kid, I've let them do that, and each kid, as we go into the movie theater, they're having their candy, I'm having my popcorn, I'm a popcorn guy, but almost always, as you eat popcorn, you start to be like, I'd like something maybe sweet or something, and each of our kids, maybe even as the movie progresses, or even just in the previews, I lean over and ask them, hey, can I have some of your candy? And every single kid, every time, they tell me no. Now, here's the beauty of this. Now, some of you have seen this. I thought, if every kid's going to do this, I'm going to film this sometime. I'm actually going to video this. And so for your enjoyment, I get to show you our youngest, Titus, as I am having some popcorn, and I decide I want some of his candy, his sour gummies. I asked him, and he did not oblige. And you get to watch what unfolded. Take a look.
Can I have this sour gummy?
No.
It allows you to prevent new purchases on your account in seconds if your card is misplaced.
Hey, do you want to share? You want to share your gummy?
No. No.
No?
It does quality. All it takes is
So,
your signature.
you gonna share?
Sign it and drive at sales event.
You want me
Hurry
to-
today.
No.
Here.
No.
No?
No.
Why not?
Mine. No. That's mine.
Should be disregarded. Pink
No.
Okay, sorry.
should be lived by.
Stop.
I don't know if you've ever been yelled at in a movie theater. It's embarrassing, and that's why the video stopped. I was doing that for those of you who think, oh, you're one of those people during the movie, during the previews. But every one of our kids has reacted the same way. And just so you get this boiled down, I mean, Titus had forgotten that I actually gave him the gummies. I mean, he'd forgotten that. And he also didn't realize that I could have gone out if I wanted to. I mean, we were watching a movie I didn't even enjoy. I could have gone out to the whole glass counter and be like, I'd like some of my own. And he also had forgotten that I'm 6'2" and can rip them from his hands. His 3-4-year-old hands, I can rip them, and I would not feel bad about it probably. But here's what he didn't learn quite then at that young age. I'm trying to help them know is that sacrifice builds trust. And I want my kids to trust me. I want to trust them. And if we don't sacrifice for each other, well, then there's a problem and the relationship kind of stalls out. Now, here's why I love to share that story, because you and God, me and God, function the same way when it comes to greed. Let me show you, because I think this helps us. God provides everything we have. That's just how it works. I mean, I don't know what you believe, but this is the truth. According to the Bible, according to all the evidence we have, what you and I have, God provides. He doesn't need what we have. He's not eyeing the car you're driving and going, I wish I could drive that car. He's not looking at your bank account going, I wish I had that a balance. He doesn't need what you and I have, and he can take it. Even in this series, we've talked about a guy named Job who had and then he lost. God can take. But there that is again. Sacrifice builds trust. And if you're unaware of this, you and I and greed has everything to do with what we sacrifice for God. Sacrifice. Sacrifice is a big word. In fact, here's how I would walk it out with us. Sacrifice defeats greed. If you don't want greed to grab a hold of you, if you don't want greed to win in your life, if you don't want to become a greedy person, you may never admit it, but others will see it. If you want to be a person that if someone were to talk about you or identify you and say, let me tell you about you, then they would say you are a giving person, you are helpful, or would they say you are greedy? And a way you find out, a way you maybe, let's call it a self-assessment, a way you know if you're greedy or not is how often do you sacrifice? Now, here's why I'm leaning into sacrifice. Sacrifice changes our attitude about what we have, okay? I need you to see this. I need you to see this because if you currently don't have a good attitude toward what you own, what you have, if you're like, hey, I don't care about it, or I don't have enough, or it's all mine, sacrifice changes our attitude about what we have. If you're like, is there a switch? Like, I don't want to be greedy today. You turn the switch off. I would tell you the switch, if there is such a thing, is sacrifice. Sacrifice. And the relationships that you and I have, listen to me closely. The relationships you have with your friend, your spouse, coworkers, they require sacrifice. If you try to have a relationship without sacrifice, that relationship will be shallow quickly. So if you're unwilling to sacrifice, can we go there for just a minute? If you're unwilling to sacrifice, if you're like, you know what, David, I think that might be my issue, is I don't really sacrifice for God or for others. But let's talk about God. I can tell you maybe a reason, a possible question to ask that if you're like, okay, I think I might be greedy because I don't really give God anything, and I'm supposed, like, here we go. Do you struggle trusting God with? And you fill in the blank, okay? We're just going to go after this. We're going to go after the potential that you and I both have some greed in our lives and that we're not being generous with God and with others. And so here's how we go after this. Do you struggle trusting God with, and think about this. Maybe you might put in there, I struggle trusting God with my kids. I have this fear that consumes me when my kids are out of my sight, and this fear, or maybe it's your marriage, and you're like, I have this fear that consumes me. Maybe it is specifically finances, and you live in fear with finances, and you would like, I struggle trusting God with my finances. I would say a group like us, there's areas that we trust God. You're like, I find it easy to trust God with my marriage or this. But there are many of us who might say, I don't trust God in that certain area. You fill in the blank. And I would tell you, if you want to trust God, if you want to live a lifestyle where you are not faking a trust in God, where when you encounter bad news, bad situations, when you encounter looking to the future and living out dreams, if you want to trust God in the midst of all of life, you've got to figure out how to regularly sacrifice for Him. And there's a beautiful story, a powerful story. I might even say an offensive story that will draw you and I to where we got to talk about sacrifice, we got to talk about trust, we got to talk about greed. Let me give you the premise to the story. There's a guy named Elijah. Now Elijah, he was a prophet. He was a guy that God would tell things to, and then he would share it with people. He was revered. People would respect him. He was known basically in terms of if people wanted to hear from God, they would often hear from Elijah, and he was well known, and he would often help people know exactly what God wanted to do. Well, Elijah found himself in a pretty destitute situation where he had no food. In fact, he was nearly starving. He came across some water where he could get water, and he prayed, like, God, help me. And God actually used birds, ravens specifically, to bring him food in the morning and the evening. I mean, just that is like, well, that's amazing. Well, eventually the water dries out because there's a drought and a famine. And God says, all right, Elijah, I want you to move on so that you can survive. I want you to move on. In fact, I want you to send you to a place. And I want you to go find a certain widow, and she'll help you. She'll help you get some food. Let's walk into the actual story. Then the Lord said to Elijah, go and live in the village of Zarephath, near the city of Sidon. I have instructed a widow there to feed you, because he's actually starving. So he went to Zarephath, and he arrived at the gates of the village. He saw a widow gathering sticks, and he asked her, would you please bring me a little water in a cup? I mean, he's doing exactly what God asked him to do. He's just playing that out. As she was going to get it, he called to her, bring me a bite of bread too. I mean, if you're missing this, like, God shows up to town, and he's like, to a widow who's struggling just as it is. Like, hey, will you give me water? Yeah, she's like, no problem. Oh, and make me a sandwich too, right? I mean, okay, I'm reading into this. But he's like, oh, and while you're at it, I need some bread. I mean, that's why so you and I read this like, that's not very nice. That's not very nice. Let her be, man. But watch as this story unfolds. But she said, I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house. And I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and a little cooking oil in the bottom of the jug. And watch what she says. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook this last meal, and then my son and I will die. I mean, if you're missing the context, I can help you get some clarity. You've got a widow who in this culture, in this setting, this widow, she did not have anyone else helping provide any kind of income or food. It was all up to her. Kind of make it even worse, they're living in a time of famine. And what we know is this widow is gathering sticks to make a fire so she can have one last minor little meal with she and her son, and then they will literally just stay in their house and starve to death. They are about to eat their last meal. And to complicate the whole last meal, can you imagine the emotions that a mom is feeling about her son and how that's going to play out? And why is this happening? To complicate the whole thing, Elijah shows up and says, hey, can you get some water and some bread for me, please? See, I think you and I, if you let yourself enter this story, if you let right now your biases towards greed and money get set aside and you let God speak to you, you would probably identify with the insecurity. The insecurity that she might be feeling of not having what you need. Let me ask you a question. Are you afraid you won't have enough? could we have just gotten to, at least closer, to the core of why you and I wrestle with greed? For those of you right now who are not so offended by the conversation, but you're willing to let your heart get healthy, are you afraid you won't have enough? I'm not trying to judge you, because you know what my answer is? I have days that I would have to confess to you. My answer is yeah. I have moments that surprise bills, surprise things get broken. And I get afraid. Afraid that I won't have enough. And when I get afraid of that I'm not going to have what I need, you know what most of us do? We clinch on tighter to what we have. And greed sets in. Most people are greedy because they are afraid they won't have enough. Watch Elijah deal with this. But Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. You notice, you don't tell someone, hey, don't be afraid. You don't say that to someone who's not afraid. Obviously, notably, I would imagine physically, she's displaying like, you want what? I don't have that. I can't afford to give that to you. If I give that to you, me and my son, we die faster. I don't have enough to give to you, Elijah. Now, don't miss the power of this story, because if you're wanting to, I would tell you there's a parallel here. If you ever wonder, why is this story in the Bible? Why is this situation of Elijah showing up to a widow on, hey, I want some bread and water? Typically, like, that's not important, that's not valuable. Why is that in the Bible? Like, let's talk about Jesus and resurrection and grace. Why is this in the Bible? I would tell you because there's a parallel. God wants you to see the parallel, where maybe you can see that Elijah is playing the role of God. And you and I play the role of the widow. If you read it that way, but Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go ahead and do just what you've said, but make a little bread for me first. Then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son. Some of you are so offended by this. And frankly, let me point out the place of major offense. It's that part. Make a little bread for me first. Just track with the conversation, track with the story. You have a starving widow and her son. She's about to make their last meal where they're going to die. A man of God shows up and says, hey, will you give me what you have? I want it first. She was like, hey, I'm going to die. Don't ask me that. Do you wonder if maybe passively she's like, hey, this is kind of like this is all I've got. Maybe you're going to retract that request. But he doesn't. He hears the information from her that she doesn't have enough. He doesn't disagree with her. He doesn't say she's lying. But he says, all right, I hear what you're saying. Still go do what I asked you to do, and make sure that as you make the meal I want served first. Make a little bread for me first. Then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son. First, make it for me first. What Elijah is doing is exactly what God does all throughout the Bible and even to modern day. He asks for the first portion. To you and I, that's offensive. To you and I, what we give our money to first, our resources to first, that's a big deal. Because right now, often that's your biggest bill, your mortgage, your rent, your grocery bill. You're like, oh, I'll tell you who gets like the first of what I get. But Elijah is bringing up a principle, not a law, bringing up a principle taught from the beginning of the Bible to the very end, even today. It's called first fruit sacrifice. Let me show you the definition of this. Let me show you what Elijah is doing. And if you draw the parallel, that perhaps this is what God does with us. The first fruit sacrifice, giving God the first part of our income. This is where we get into some powerful moments with the Lord. You see, did you know that all throughout history, God asks from you and I to have the first of whatever we earn? The first. It's called the first fruit sacrifice. It's where you and I take the first portion of our paycheck, the first portion of what we earn, and we return it to God as an act of gratitude, trust, sacrifice. It is actually a mechanism that God built into place from the beginning, not because he needed what we had, but he wanted to protect us against a love for money. Other parts of the Bible talk about a love for money is the root of so many kinds of evil. This principle that Elijah is saying, I want first, I want you to give me first, the portion first, you and I find it offensive, but what he's trying to help her understand is powerful trust that God is a provider. This principle has been played out for a long time, actually. In fact, I can give you an example called the outer 10%. This has been played out. Here's how this worked. There are many folks, especially in history, that they didn't technically make money in the sense that, hey, I go and get a paycheck. What they would do is they would grow crops, and they would take those crops and they would trade those crops for other things that they needed. They would barter, they would do different things like that. But what farmers would do, the people who actually raise crops, they would grow crops just like you and I see this. This is not unfamiliar to you and I. Come on, we live in South Dakota. We understand this. They would grow crops, but here's how it worked. Because they believe you give God the first. And so here's what happened. They would grow the crops. It's time to harvest the crops. And the farmer would not do what you and I normally would do, where we start on the outside and we just start to harvest the crops from the outside to the inside. They would actually step in a little bit into the crop and then begin to harvest, and they would leave the outer part of the crop standing. The outer 10%, they would leave it up. In essence, leaving a circle or a box. And then here's what would happen. The poor, widows, people who were incapable of working a normal job would then come to the farmer's field and would take that outer 10% for themselves so that they would have enough food to sustain themselves. It's a beautiful picture of what God has asked us to do, to not be greedy, to not be greedy. Do you currently right now give your outer 10% so that the less fortunate, the poor, the lost can have what they need? Watch what happens. She's afraid, and I get that. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There will always be flour and olive oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again. So she did as Elijah said. And she said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and olive oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. It is a beautiful story, but I just want to point something out here. There was always enough. There was always enough. There was always enough. Do you remember I asked you if you were afraid you wouldn't have enough? What if I could tell you, in which I can, that God has a plan to make sure you always have enough? His plan for you and I to have enough is to return to him the first 10% of whatever we get. And although you're like, David, that does not make sense. That does not make sense. I need that. I'm not going to have enough if I give it. No, his plan is for you and I to trust him with generosity. And then he will provide. If you didn't notice this, do you notice that they did not have what they needed until the widow was willing to sacrifice? Do you notice that there was not like everything showed up first and then, oh, cool, now we got it, now we can live for Jesus? No, there wasn't any of that. That's how you and I function. Do you notice, in fact, that if she didn't sacrifice, if she wasn't generous to Elijah, do you realize that all three of them would have died? But she decided to fight greed. In fact, here it is. Generosity defeats greed. She defeated any temptation of greed, and the way she did it was to be generous. To be generous. Many of us think that we cannot be generous until we have enough, and God's saying, I will not give you enough until you're generous. See, generosity is the first step, not the next step, not the third step, not the fifth step, not the after I'm retired step. Generosity is always the first step for then God to provide, because trust and sacrifice are critical. In fact, we as a church, one of our core values, we only have 3. One of our core values is irrational generosity. And some might say, oh, because Fountain Springs Church has generosity mastered. No, we don't. We are not perfect at generosity, but we want to be good at it, so we value it. And I would tell you, as a church, what God designed the church to be about is to be generous. So what I'm about to share with you, I don't know what it's going to do. But I thought if I'm going to talk about generosity and how we defeat greed, then I, as pastor of Fountain Springs Church, should bring up our current heartbeat, our blood pressure. How good is Fountain Springs Church at being generous? I'll show you. 2/3, 66.6%, 2 out of 3 Fountain Springers that call Fountain Springs Church home, 2/3 of us give $0 to the church. That means, if you aren't good at math, that only 1/3 of the people who call Fountain Springs Church home give to the church. And you need to know who's in that 1/3. My 5-year-old, my 9-year-old, and my 14-year-old. I want you to be a part of a church who is irrationally generous. I want you to be a part of a group that God designed to play out this way, where we would be generous, that we would trust God with money, that we would not be greedy. But I'm going to tell you right now, the current blood pressure of Fountain Springs Church is that we are greedy. So what if we changed? What if you and I stopped being greedy? What if you and I decided to change the fact that 2/3 of our church gives nothing to the church, gives nothing to God? What would happen? Well, I did some studying. Here's what would happen if we decided to give back to God. I didn't make these up, by the way, because some of us are like, oh my. If all of us started giving to God the way God instructed, the outer 10%, the first 10%, each year we would invest $1 million into local needs and global needs. $1 million. In 18 months, we would eliminate all of our church debt. And you're like, well, that doesn't sound like too sexy. Well, if we don't have debt, then we can take that money that we put toward debt and even give away more. That's why that's significant. And we would launch a new Fountain Springs Church location, a new church each year in surrounding communities and states. And if you're like, okay, if you know a friend who has moved away or lives in a town that's small town, medium-sized or large town, like we need a church where anyone and everyone is welcome. We as a church would like to put a church there. But we can't do that unless you and I decide to defeat greed. So let me sum this up. Let me bring you to where we're at. Queen brought up the lyrics, but God's been dealing with it for centuries. Here's what greed versus Christian look like. If you live by greed, you would say, I am my provider. You believe that you are your source of everything. And if you live that way, you're going to live in greed. You're going to hold tightly to what you own, and you're going to think it's yours, and it's not. But a Christian, I'm going to talk to just the Christians right now. If you're not a Christian, you can tune me out or just listen out of curiosity. A Christian believes God is the provider, is my provider. And I'm going to tell you, as a Christian myself, as a follower of Jesus Christ and pastor of this church, I am calling us out to live this way so that the poor, the needy, the widows, the orphans, so that people who are lost and don't know who Jesus is, so they can know, so they can be provided for. I believe God said, I want the church to exist to deal with this. And so I'm challenging us. In fact, here's what I'm going to offer. The 3-month tithe challenge. Very simple. The 3-month tithe challenge. Here's what it is. If you would commit for 3 months, you're going to have a card, and you can fill that card out, but you put your information on that card and you commit to 3 months. You're like, David, I don't know if I can have enough. I understand if you feel like you don't have enough. That's how the widow felt. Technically, she didn't have enough. If you want to have enough and you want God to be your provider, I'm challenging you to take the 3-month challenge. Here's how this works, is for the next 3 months, you take your income and you give 10% of each paycheck to the church. And I believe God will give you enough. I believe God will provide for you. He'll take care of you. But here's how I want to help you in this trust step. We as a church have always committed to this. If at the end of the 3 months after you've tithed and followed a budget and you're like, yeah, God didn't give me enough, well, then we'll return all that you've given to the church over those 3 months. That's how much we believe that God is our provider. He has enough, and He wants to give us enough. So, church, listen up. If you don't want to be greedy, you've got to start sacrificing. And you start sacrificing by giving to God a portion of what He's already given you. I'm taking this challenge. Our staff is taking this challenge. The elders are taking this challenge. I hope you'll take this challenge. In fact, let me pray for you. God, there are many of us right now who are rejoicing because we see the value of who you are and we want to give to you. But God, there are many people who are far from rejoicing. There's a challenge. There's a pain in the gut that's saying, I don't know how to do this. I don't know if I'm going to have enough. God, would you help us trust you? Would you help us believe in you and how much you love us? Lord, I pray for everyone who's going to take this challenge. Lord, would you please, in the name of Jesus, provide for them, supply every one of their needs, bless them. Will you take care of all their food, their clothing, their shelter? And Lord, I pray that you will pour upon blessings in their lives where they undeniably see you as the provider. God, we love you. Thank you for always providing. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.